Hello friend, I hope you're doing well. I've been giving a lot of thought to the concept of tensegrity and how that plays out in the human being. And I've come up with this model for examining the tension between our intrinsic motivation, our internal state, and our drives and ambitions, and the extrinsic motivation, the external world, which is the suggestions for what goals we should be pursuing and what work to endeavor towards that will be rewarded or incentivized by society. So I feel that that's a very good way of thinking about the victory conditions and the missions as this radius of extrinsic motivation that creates the space for us to dwell within, where we're all pursuing the sustainable way of life that will allow us to continue playing the game for the most of us that we can, for as long as possible, is ultimately the goal of what we should be extending our energy towards if we want to have a concordant path for humanity. So there is a space that is created between those two tensions, right? If they are held at the correct distance from one another, what Buckminster Fuller and futuristic designers refer to as fit, you have a comfortable area that is not too oppressed from without and not too forced from within, and you have comfort. So in order to create this space between where we can develop community and be in right relationship with one another, I think it is helpful to consider these concepts and to look at it holistically if we can, and take the things into consideration in a balanced way. So the concept for the internal state that kept cropping up in my mind, how to describe it, if we were to simplify it for each of the factions, would be in terms of virtue. And virtue, for our purposes, right, we're not trying to virtue signal or communicate an overinflated sense of value or goodness through trying to check certain boxes, right? Virtue is what you do because it's what you would do, because it's what you do when no one else is around or no one's looking, because it's just your mode of being. It's what feels right and natural. It's a mode you fall into in flow, or in states where you have abandoned a particular narrative or your ego or whatever, right? That is where virtue lies, the thing that is its essence or itself, or the suchness. So paradoxically, in trying to describe it, it ceases to be what it is. It can only be what it is in its embodiment, in its incarnation within the person. But we can speak to the flavors of that as far as being facets of this central existential goodness, right, that is latent within all life. And that is the will to live, the curiosity and the playfulness and the drive that we have to be involved in life, to interact in our environment, to play the game, as social creatures, to interact with one another. So at the center of all of this, that singularity of existence itself is the true, the good, and the beautiful that is emanating prismatically through these facets. So we're going to go through the 12 facets in terms of their virtue and what that is and how it's defined, and then talk about the relationship and the tension that it has with the missions. And I'm going to be working on another concept to describe these missions and these victory conditions in a way that has been kind of coined the antagonisms, right? I typically avoid speaking of it in those terms because it's better to dwell on the generative and the positive, but I think that there is also a more holistic way to look at the negatives in life instead of in these polar opposites, because for one thing, it's not necessarily a one-to-one, and the way that we react to negativity is not in just one-to-one polarity, cause and effect. There's this myriad of choices that we have at our disposal in any given challenge or situation. And I think alchemically, fundamentally, feeling secure, being integrated, having sovereignty, widens your choice space, and then acting out of fear or feeling restricted or that there's only one way narrows it. So there is a proportionality to that, and I'm still exploring how that might shake out. But For our purposes in this model, we're going to continue to speak in terms of the missions as extrinsic motivation. So, first up, we have Aries, whose virtue and intrinsic motivation is courage. And courage is the ability to initiate despite fear or resistance or hesitation, to take action even in the face of adversity. And of course, having the scrutiny to determine when that's appropriate. So having an improper tension and imbalance would be, having too much or too little of that thing. You want to have the right proportion between the intrinsic motivation of courage and its external manifestations as far as the militarization issues, policing, physicality. So all of the victory condition videos already have extensive definitions, so we're not going to go too much into them in here. I'm just going to kind of point to their relationship. But feel free to refer back to those videos if you'd like a more lengthy explanation. So next we have Taurus, whose virtue is generosity. And generosity ties into the issue of creating and distributing food. And in excess, that can be very harmful, and in shortage, we have famine. So having those things in balance is very important. With Gemini, we have discipline, and that plays out, as the focused attention on a single task and ability to develop and specialize one thing. We see that in the digital landscape and on the internet as communication technology and cyber integrity and all of those things. For Cancer, we have compassion as the virtue. And we see that as the driving force in pursuing community spaces and raising the quality of life for everyone and attending to people's needs and caring for them, right? For Leo, the virtue is loyalty, and we see that a little more, that one might come off as a little more abstract, but we see that in energy generation, particularly human energy generation, in the concept of morale, in the concept of, positivity and drive and desire to keep playing and playfulness. And that is a derivative of loyalty because maybe my definition is a little bit different than other people's. But for me, that loyalty comes from the desire to keep playing with that person, right? The desire to keep having experiences with them, keep putting in time with them. So it's picking is the loyalty is like the continued focused attention on that and that continuity. And you need that for addressing issues of energy generation, both in the human being and in the needs of the human being for consuming energy out in the world in the form of solar radiation or otherwise. For Virgo, we have prudence. That one's maybe a little more clear, tying into wellness and healthcare, developing medication and technology surrounding surgery and things like that. Prudence is a good thing to have, right? Focus and diligence applied to very practical things. For Libra, we have temperance, which is balance, ability to self-regulate, which ties into conflict resolution, as well as the urban planning, civil engineering, right? Having the correct distribution of weight within a space. So it has the visual of the scales. Also to do with the automation. Temperance and application of automation is very important to ensure that we're not replacing ourselves completely or removing avenues of what we enjoy, what it takes to be human, things like that. For Scorpio, we have purity, which ties into contaminant remediation, removal of toxins from the environment, and potentially having chemical intervention or some sort of bioengineering that has to occur, because not all contamination can be removed mechanically. Sometimes there will have to be other interventions that we develop. For Sagittarius, we have integrity, which has to do with bringing things together, making them whole, which ties into the promotion and cultivation of mental health with recreation and rehabilitation of people who have been incarcerated, right? We want integration. We want rehabilitation. We don't want to just lock them away forever. So that has to do with integrity and conducting oneself from a place of valuing that individual. For Capricorn, we have fortitude. Pretty straightforward. That has to do with the development of structure, platforms, and very solid, practical architectural applications. Being strong, solid, dependable. Fortitude is pretty straightforward. For Aquarius, we have adaptation, which might be a little of a weird one too. It's very broad, right? Adaptation could apply to all of this as a concept. But in this context, we're looking at adaptation as a virtue, as something more like openness, as being willing to try different things and experiment and change, and putting that priority first and foremost. And you see that in logistics very clearly, right? Needing to try out different routes and tinker with things and adapt to changing environmental circumstances, as well as the resource accessibility, updating of models, taking in fresh information and integrating it, and collaborative workspaces or flex spaces, and developing the types of spaces that are going to meet the demand of new processes in the market, right? When you have a maker space, you're going to need to adapt to the type of activities that will take place there. And for Pisces, we have vigilance. And vigilance means the careful attention, the watchfulness to notice when things are out of sync or out of balance. And that ties into identifying streams of waste or excess or blockages or problems, right? It's being able to hang back and observe and make assessments in that way. And also with human resources, right? Being attentive and being watchful of the human interactions and the processes that are happening within a system, and making sure that they are generative and productive. So those are the 12 facets and flavors of virtue as this inner drive and intrinsic motivation. Now we'll talk about a specific example of what that sensation really feels like, of the tension between the external world and the demands it's placing on us to contribute and be productive and belong and all of those things, and our inner world, and how those two things are coming into correct distance and tension, and how sometimes that can go wrong, what that looks like. So we'll use the example of Capricorn. The virtue of fortitude. Internally, the virtue and the drive, the gift that we are trying to give when it's in the appropriate amounts, is for security, is for stability, is to have a place to stand, right? To give people someplace to start from, a place to branch out from and become more of themselves, right? Think of it as the soil, the rock, the foundation. And so internally that's coming from a place of good. But when that is in excess, when it ceases to be virtue and slides into excess, we see imbalance in the world in the form of too much top-down authority, limitation, stagnation, rigidity. It can go as far as tyranny, in its ultimately in virtuous form. And so how we respond to that within the individual is to recognize that the excess is pushed by too much reward or incentive or demand from the extrinsic that is not in alignment with being in balance internally, with that coming from a place of a natural flow of just something that we would want to do because it's who we are, right? When it ceases to be that, when it becomes excessive drive or ambition towards being rewarded in the external, right, that's where you get more of the classical vices as far as avarice, greed, wrath, what we would think of as those kind of vices. And then if you have a shortage of it, if you don't have enough fortitude, right, you are weak, you are brittle, you don't have a leg to stand on, you can't get any sort of leverage to try to raise anything else up or improve things. So you want to be cultivating that sense of fortitude from a place of having that be the version of you that you want to bring out into the world. And I've been messing with this concept as far as how you can do in your personal practices, or if there are types of embodiment practices that have already been developed. Does that map onto something like these virtues? Is there a way to specifically cultivate these? And I think I've mentioned it before, but in doing the LARP with Conquest, the way that was handled was elementally, and it was actually very interesting that there were specific activities that were meant to represent or cultivate or call attention to particular virtues. And so a bank of them basically was kind of distributed among the 4 elements based on what was thought to be their natures. And for Earth, which is the tribe that I was in, fortitude was one of them, and one of the ways that you would show, strength and conditioning in that was to do circumambulation, was to run around the shrine that we were protecting at the time. And you do see that procedure in many faiths and traditions. In Hinduism specifically, circumambulation of a shrine is an actual practice. I don't know that I would say that's specifically linked with constitution or fortitude in that context, but it's interesting to see how those practices are already being enacted all over the world. And maybe there is a mapping, if we were to look at those all together, maybe it would coordinate in this way, that there are 12 facets of embodiment practice, or maybe we could call them psychotechnology or something else. There are all of these words in this digital landscape that are being used to try to approach psychological techniques or embodiment practices or meditation or whatever you want to call it, to improve specific areas. And sort of the thought experiments that my partner and I have really been playing with a lot in these recent months is, how do you provide a roadmap for that? How do you provide, especially from my biases visually, because I find that to be the most stimulating and workable and memorable, in particular development of graphics, and that's where this one came about, was really, really pushing to provide something solid and actionable, and how that can be useful in this space. But something like a roadmap or something like a chart that can identify things that are already known to be effective and useful, and how the relationship that those might have with one another. And if there is a tensegrity to that, if there is sort of that radiant nature, totally nerdy offshoot, but it's kind of been on the brain today. I guess it's a mood. My father and I, when I was young, he had this book series that he read of chapter books. It's totally weird, nerdy, and obscure, but I kind of latched onto it, and it was one of our bonding things that we both clung to. It's called the Destroyer series. And one of the key tenets of the martial arts master, who is one of the main characters, is that his practice is the sun, from which all of the other martial arts are just rays, right? They're radiating. And that visual really stuck with me, and I think there is a lot of truth in there to, of course, not claiming that any one path is the one true one in the way that that character conveys in the book is meant to be a very judgmental superiority thing. I think there is a truth to the idea that if we were to try to trace back the traditions, we would find a common heritage, and a lot of people have tried to do this with religion and wisdom tradition to illustrate the fact that we are all on the same team, we're all the same, we're all following paths of light. Those are all good sentiments too. I'm a little more interested in the very technical, can we trace back these traditions into a set of practices or actions that can potentially cultivate, say, specific elements? That would already be really great. Or even, broader in the set of 12, could you choose one and turn your attention to it and develop that within yourself to become more well-rounded? If you can identify an area you're deficient, can you intentionally cultivate that? And then the further thought experiment do these supposed organs of the psyche, right, that I have mapped the factions out to be, do they correlate potentially to specific areas or to specific cognitive functions? Is it possible to improve, right? There are a lot of studies being done into how to improve areas of the brain and plasticity in general and all those things through different practicing music, doing stimulating brain game activities, doing math, right? All of these things to improve general cognition. Those things are fairly measurable. When we go to something as abstract as like, is there a way to cultivate yourself as a total human being in your interaction with other human beings? How can you improve your communication? Not just through having a big vocabulary or learning another language or things like that. We do know those are helpful. Those are all good things to do. Is there another set of practices that a person could engage in, including but not limited to meditation? Although I think meditation is really touted as this sort of cure-all, coconut oil, everybody should just do it all the time thing. That's maybe not the case, and certainly is not effective for everyone. It's not always for me. I think there's a lot more to it than that. But could we possibly map, even onto the areas of the brain that are getting stimulated, practices or, and how mundane are they? Is a question that I've really been asking a lot lately. Often in, I have another guilty pleasure, these Taoist Chinese cultivation dramas and shows and things. I love watching those. It's so good. The common theme in a lot of them is that in representing what for the characters is, thousands of years of practice and magical cultivation and development of power and martial arts or whatever else, are often represented in completely mundane activities, and a lot of the weapons that they're using are actually very mundane things. Instruments in particular, musical instruments, are used a lot to represent channeling devices for that elemental or usually it's called more root, right? The Chinese elements don't map directly onto the 4-element system. So the cultivation of that is often depicted in doing weird little quests or chores. Sometimes it's very breaking the fourth wall and gamified and quite comical. I highly recommend, at least once try to watch one of those shows. There's a lot on Netflix and they're pretty cool. If nothing else for the visual appeal, they're very beautiful and a lot of people put a lot of great work into the costumes and the music. But the point that they're trying to make, I think, which is so important, is that even in the little mundane things that we're doing in life, and that's very common in all Eastern philosophy and tradition, is like doing even the little things well is a reflection of your character and is in some way a cultivation of your life and yourself, right? That you should, how you do one thing is how you do everything, and that you should do your best even in sweeping the floor, right? And even things which seem to us really mundane or trivial, especially in the West, and things that often get relegated to automation or to robots or whatever, the chores, that there's something about taking the time to do them yourself and doing a good job, and the attention that it turns to your, especially with cleaning, right? The attention it turns to your environment and causes you to think about, oh, I haven't used this in years, why do I still have this? Maybe I should get rid of this and get something else, or, I really need to be more minimalistic and simplify my space, right? I have all this clutter and it's cluttering my mind, right? All of those concepts, I think, are so beautifully illustrated by this concept of if you could have a character, that's thousands of years old, right? That's just the energy or the soul that even in the celestial realms that they're playing around in these shows are doing these mundane things, or they're doing these seemingly very... It's not all sword fights, it's not all these epic quests. Sometimes it's what you do at home, sometimes it's what you do in your real life. So that's where a lot of focus and attention has kind of been in the community development that we've been doing, as far as looking at the practices, looking at what people can actually do to sort themselves out, to make their life better, to get themselves put together and feel integrated, to heal through trauma. And of course, nothing on this channel is meant in any way to be advisory or prescriptive. but it would be cool to be able to map that and point to the people who are doing those things and who are qualified to report on how best to enact those practices in your life. So I hope that this video is somewhat helpful in consolidating this victory condition concept. As I said, I have a lot more work to do on it and really communicating what it is that I have inside that I have to say about it. I've done a terrible job thus far, but I'm going to keep trying. It means a certain thing to me, and I have the sense that it might mean something similar to other people and could be part of the solution to being in right relationship with one another and truly, deeply, authentically appreciating the gifts that they have to bring into the world, their dignity just as a human being and as a living thing, and truly energize and motivate one another and get past this nihilistic dread that we're all experiencing amidst the oppressive global news climate, to pursue what is meaningful in these victory conditions, not just because the planet is on fire and if we don't sequester the carbon, everything's going to explode, because that's obviously not the case. It's to appreciate the nuance of the challenges that we're faced with, the fact that we're going to have to collaborate very deeply to see that they are paid proper attention to. And maybe even have fun doing it. Maybe even have a sense of satisfaction instead of a sense of doom, from trying to see the ways that we've been going, the trajectory that we're on. And regardless of what the stock market or some official is telling us we need to be doing differently, like to make sovereign choices about the world that we want to have and be able to, in a very real way, see the impact of what we are doing in achieving that goal. The thing that we want the most is to matter. Fundamentally, we want to belong. We want to matter. We want our efforts not to be in vain. We would like for there to be some legacy that lives beyond our death, out of our time here on this earth. And I think now more than ever, people feel very distanced from that and very ineffectual. And it's very sad. It's very regrettable, especially in recent months. We'll never really know the losses that we've suffered. But I think the best thing that we can do to honor that is to keep moving forward and make it worth